Okay, dear colleagues, please let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this session of loss and damage. So this session focuses particularly on the aspects of the losses that the African continent faces, in particular in regards to the impacts of climate change. And now we have a new fund called the Loss and Damage Fund. And this fund is supposed to support countries to be able to not only adapt, also to mitigate to the consequences of climate change. In particular, this session focuses on the context of Africa. How does loss and damage affect the continent? How do we expect this new fund to support the continent achieve some of, or at least mitigate some of the risks? But also, what is currently happening? What are some of our partners doing to mitigate these changes and to support countries to be able to manage the loss and the damage that are caused by the impacts of climate change? So starting this session, we do have a very brief agenda for you. First, we're going to have remarks from Dr. Male Fofana, the Regional Director, Africa for GGGI. And then we're supposed to have set the scene by Dr. George Wamkoye from the African Group of Negotiators. This is then followed by a panel discussion from GGGI, whereby we shall be represented by Gabriel, as well as from WFP and ARC. From WFP, we have Tiwonge, and then from ARC, I believe we're still waiting for our colleague to attend, Papa Diarra, and as soon as he does, we shall be able to start the panel discussion. So moving forward, I would like to open the floor to Dr. Male for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Nayuman. Thank you also for setting the scene, but also moderating the sessions. So good morning, good afternoon as well for colleagues in South Korea and those who join in person, but also online. I think it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this important session on loss and damage. It's a topic that resonates deeply with the reality faced by many communities across Africa, as well as we reflect on the outcomes of the COP27, particularly the landmark agreement to establish a loss and damage fund that will be effective during this COP29. Although we recognize this is a crucial step toward addressing the profound impact of the climate crisis on low-emitting, vulnerable nations, for the African countries, this fund represents a glimmer of hope and an acknowledgement of the disproportionate burden our continent bear despite contributing a less to the global emission. However, my thinking really is that while we announcing the fund is an important victory, our work is far from over. The challenge now lies in ensuring that this fund is structured, allocated, and delivered in the way that truly reach those communities most affected in the continent. We must recognize that the most vulnerable communities, those living in the dry lands, farmers battling severe drought, and coastal communities facing rising sea levels, often have the least representation at the decision-making table. And that's why we call them really vulnerable communities. And in this session, we will explore the specific loss and damage experience across Africa, because we have in the past a lot of engagement when it comes to these topics, not really new. But learning from those experiences will help us to really reducing the learning curve, but also seeing how our member states and countries can learn from that and just use effectively that coming loss and damage fund. We will learn from the communities struggling to recover from increasingly frequent drought to entire ecosystem, strengthened by gradual climate shift. We must consider the full spectrum of the climate impact, both sudden but also slow onset crisis. Our focus today is to dive into this loss can be mitigated, how vulnerable population can better be protected, and most importantly, how the loss and damage fund can be leveraged to make real difference on the ground. With thoughtful and strategic planning, African governments have the chance to transform how dryland regions are supported through recurring drought and how communities can better adapt to the growing threat of climate change. We must also ensure that the fund distribution is not just about financial aid, but about fostering resilience and enabling communities to rebuild their livelihood sustainability. Today's discussion will examine pathway of tapping into the Loss and Damage Fund effectively. We will explore ways to ensure that this funding not only provide relief for the immediate impact of climate crisis, but also strengthen our collective ability to prepare for mitigate future for our population. So I look really forward to hearing from the esteemed panelists as they share insight on how we can move forward from COP27 breakthrough toward real, actionable solution for Africa regarding the Loss and Damage Fund. And I have no doubt that together we can work toward the future where loss and damage are minimized, where resilience is built, and where those most affected by climate change are empowered to shape their own destiny. Thank you for all, and also I wish you all a productive event, impactful session ahead. Thank you for joining also the Loss and Damage session. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Dr. Mali, for this powerful opening speech. You have mentioned two things, that first and foremost, tapping into the Loss and Damage Fund is something that has to be effectively managed and that it should have impact. You've also mentioned the fact that loss and damage is a collective concept. It means that it pretty much affects everybody and nobody is actually left out of it. The impact that loss and damage has does not decide from whether it's a developed or a developing country. But the consequence for Africa is that as a nation that is still in the process of becoming an advanced society, there are still some bottlenecks that makes the impacts of climate change much more powerful on the continent. So moving forward, I want to thank you again, Dr. Mali, for that. And we really appreciate your presence today. And I think you've set the challenge quite high for our panelists today. Thank you for that. So moving forward, we do have setting the scene by Dr. Wamkoye from the Africa Group of Negotiators. I hope he is online. He's mentioned he's online, so I hope he has an opportunity to show his video.
Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can be able to hear you,
Okay.
Dr. Wamkoye. So just before we start, I wanted to make sure you're connected. So we'll just a brief introduction of who Dr. Wamkoye is to everybody online. Dr. Wamkoye is the lead negotiator for the Africa Group of Negotiators. And more importantly, he has extensive experience negotiating some of the impactful and important conversation that Africa needs to have and bringing that to the table in important discourses and platforms such as the UN CCC. So more importantly is that through the Africa Group of Negotiators, a lot of the challenges that Africa as a whole, as a continent, cannot bring to the fore is actually brought to the fore and discussed and deliberated and pushed forward by Agnes. So it is our pleasure to have Dr. Wamkoye here today, who is going to give us snapshot of the challenges it takes to bring this discourse to the fore, and also the incredible successes that has been put forward, the challenge for Africa, and more importantly, the opportunities when it comes to loss and damage. Over to you, Dr. Wamkoya.
Yeah, thanks very much, moderator, and thanks, colleagues, and thanks for inviting me to make a few remarks on this very, very important subject. As you've been correctly said, I actually lead G77 and China in negotiations on agriculture, but also, of course, support the Africa Group on all the preparations in that respect. Loss and damage is very, very important for Africa, given the increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events that Africa is experiencing. And I think the Horn of Africa has had extreme droughts. And you recall there was that experience in Southern Africa where they experienced several cyclones that traversed that region, and therefore loss and damage is something that is important. And happy to again build on what has already been said by the director, that loss and damage having been agreed in COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think it was a very, very important decision. But from a negotiations point of view, we feel that, yes, it was a big milestone, but it made us lose focus on adaptation. And that's why we are now trying to bring adaptation again to the fore, given that at least now we have settled on establishment of a fund and a mechanism on its operationalization. And so good progress, but has implications on the existing framework in respect to mobilizing resources. As you may all be aware that when in 2010, we agreed on the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, it was also agreed that we should have a 50-50, 50% adaptation, 50% mitigation. And now the question that now arises with this new fund, and this leads into the negotiations that are going to be very critical at COP29 with respect to new goal on climate finance, is how do we treat loss and damage? Is it as part of the bigger picture, traditional adaptation and mitigation, or we now will treat it as the third element of that configuration so that we have mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage? And so that conversation is critical, and already we see within the G77 parties starting not to agree on a common approach, given that many parties, particularly from the AOCs, who have been on this thing for many years, even before the UNFCCC convention was adopted, they had already started talking about losses and damages, who proposed that within the quantum of the new goal of finance, we should have a recognition and a percentage or whatever with respect to losses and damages. Whereas the other parties also within G77 hold the view that we need not to destabilize the configuration of adaptation and mitigation. And so where do we place losses and damages? The second, which means therefore, there will be definitely need to clarify the relationship between the loss and damage fund, as we can call it, and the existing funds, particularly the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. How do we delineate those capitalization? The second is that, as you're all aware, the COP established a framework for operationalization of the fund in COP28, and they already have appointed the executive chief executive, and that means learning from the other funds, particularly GCF. I think now the Loss and Damage Fund has an opportunity really to avoid mistakes, but also move faster in terms of its putting in place instruments for its operationalization, because this is a critical issue that is urgent and requires a faster decision making. And so we believe that with this committee, the board that has been established, we hope that now that the executive chief executive has been appointed, we hope that they will be able to move and establish operational tools that will be able to facilitate the fund being operational. The other point that I think is important is a whole question of capitalization, and of course this links to the point I've just raised about the new quantifiable climate fund goal, which as you recall, we got pledges of about 700 million. That is grossly inadequate given the losses and damages across the world. And I think this is critical in terms of making sure that it is properly capitalized so that it's able to help those countries in distress and build sustainable programs, as Director Fana said, so that it's not seen as a crisis response fund, but also building sustainable programs that move us and build resilience. And therefore, at COP29, there's going to be a lot of interest, one, on the governance instruments and the progress they have made so that the fund can start disbursing or organizing support. And number two will be on the fund itself, capitalization. Are we able to mobilize resources really to support losses and damages in that respect? And then, of course, the political question will be the relationship between the fund and the existing funds, particularly GCF and Adaptation Fund, and whether they are going to sign some governance instrument that facilitates resources to flow from GCF, where it may have a little bit more resources towards loss and damage fund. So that relationship is going to be very, very critical. Number two is about what I said about the balance between losses and damages and adaptation. And this is largely important, given that since 1992 and as per the convention, you find that traditionally it has been seen, climate change has been seen in the context of mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And through Paris Agreement in Article 8, it was realized that it was important to deal with loss and damage as a separate, because it's a critical area that gets swallowed in adaptation unless it is, and that's why we had particular provisions in respect to losses and damages. Now, how we treat it is going to determine whether it's able to mobilize resources in that respect. The third thing that I think is important, and we have done some work, Agnes has done some work in that respect, is the whole question of attribution. Because, because the fund is supposed to be dealing with those extreme weather events, we're trying to, one, how will Africa be able to demonstrate that what they have suffered is as a result of climate change, and therefore those losses and damages would fall within the meaning of the loss and damage fund. And this is critical because we were trying to look at evidence that supports that, and we find there's little evidence from Africa on losses and damages. There was some little work done in 2008-9 up to 10 there on losses and damages by UNECA, ECA, but not much work has been done in this, which means therefore we may end up in Africa using the losses and damage fund as more of a humanitarian intervention as opposed to a strategic intervention that has a long-term vision as to how we reduce the losses and damages while building resilience of both countries and systems and people so that they are able to bounce back. And then therefore, the issue of attribution is critical. We did bring together experts from across Africa where we were looking at the attribution and the gaps, knowledge gaps arising from the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, and indeed attribution in relation to losses and damages turned out to be one of the areas where we have the largest gap, and therefore we need a little bit more information. And I'm happy to report that a number of scientists now from Africa are doing some work on attribution, and we hope this can fit into the discussions around losses and damages, and more so with respect to operationalization and prioritization of interventions under that fund. And so one of the limitations that we may face as Africa is the whole question of attribution. To what extent are we able to attribute those crises, what we call crisis, to climate change, and therefore qualifying to be losses and damages. And finally, the discourse that we have now is that we believe that the fund should not run as a humanitarian, because we know, and I'm happy that among the panelists that you have is somebody from WFP and others who are practitioners in this area, and they should be able actually to help to shape the way this fund can be framed so that it can be complementary to the work that is already being done by these organizations, so that it's not seen that the fund is coming to replace that important role that institutions like WFP and others are doing, especially when communities and countries face these extreme weather events and crisis. And so I would want to stop there just to emphasize again that loss and damage is very important for Africa. However, there are a few challenges that we need to be aware of. One is the scientific evidence in terms of attribution, and therefore, unless we up that piece of work, it is going to be very difficult to justify some of those crises in that respect. Secondly, we need to delineate those that would fall under traditional GCF or adaptation fund, and what this fund would focus on, so that we don't have a diffuse relationship between this and nobody takes responsibility, and yet this appears to be a specific fund which is supposed to deal with specific role. And number three is the capitalization, and that capitalization must not be conditional, as is the case in GCF, where partners say this money must be done or used for this, which may go against the urgency and immediacy of a crisis in the event that the conditionalities appear to be in conflict with the operations of the fund. But otherwise, it's going to be a lively discussions. Parties will be wanting to know the extent to which it is been ready for operationalization now that we have the chief executive, and more importantly, the capitalization that will make the fund a reality. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, George, for that, and for bringing a snippet of the challenges that are still existing, and also the opportunities that we should not forget, or at least we must attempt to make sure we capitalize on. That is ensuring that there is a difference between the loss and damage fund as opposed to the other fund, the capitalization of the fund in relation to the existing funds, such as the GCF fund and the adaptation fund, and ensuring that loss and damage fund does not become an aspect that is focused purely on humanitarian, but rather it should be considered in a much more holistic manner. And the one way we can do that is to ensure that we have the relevant data that can back up the information on the intersectionality between the impacts of climate change, the losses that it's having on the communities and the economy in Africa. But for that to happen, we have to be able to attribute the causality and the direct linkages between the two. I think that there is still a lot to go. However, also what you have mentioned, which is tremendous, is that a lot has happened, and we have come a long way. Not only the G77, but also having the African Group of Negotiators pushing this discourse for Africa continent, pushing it for developing countries to be able to have a seat at the table and to be able to at least advocate the importance of having such a fund. So I think congratulations again to the African Group of Negotiators for pushing that discourse. And moving forward, as you've rightly put it, we are bringing in practitioners who are currently supporting member countries in Africa, not only to mitigate, adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also start collecting the relevant data, the scientific evidence that is needed, and that Africa will need at least to show attribution, but more importantly, already supporting African countries to be able to start thinking forward on how they can be able to effectively utilize the fund once it becomes operational. So thank you once again, Dr. George Wamkoya. We know that you have a busy schedule today, and we were honored that you were able to have this conversation with us. I do not know if you have last words before you log off, Dr. George.
Yeah, thanks. I have to leave because I'm teaching another group. Yeah, but I think what I think is important is that this year and next year are very important years in the calendar of UNFCCC. One is that we have long-term low emission and development strategies being developed. Countries are supposed to develop those. And therefore, having a section on loss and damage, I think, will be very, very important to show where we are, where we want to go, and how what actions are being proposed. Because then you're already sending a message to the fund that we have a clear roadmap as to what we want to do. The second is the NDC 3.0. As you are all aware, countries are supposed to submit a successive NDC, at least ordinarily by by February 2025. Unfortunately, as per the meeting which GGI attended also in Rwanda, Kigali last week, it's many countries in from across Africa are far away from even starting the process, and therefore it's going to be very important to look at those NDCs and not just change the year, but now give it a new look and identify critically those aspects that relate to losses and damages, which then can lend themselves to the fund. And of course, next year, 2025, is the year when we are supposed to submit national adaptation plans. Again, a very important instrument, and we already provided a pathway that by 2030 we want to assess the implementation of the national adaptation plan. And if we don't get all these things into those policy documents that are official documents for government, but also under UNFCCC, then it's going to be very difficult to be able to benefit and access these opportunities presented by Loss and Damage Fund and other related funding opportunities. And of course, we must distinguish how we deal with the immediate and crisis vis-a-vis building on the crisis and looking at the long-term vision so that we build resilience, as Fofana did emphasize. And with that, thank you very much, and wishing you an excellent and good discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. George Okoye. And for this, we move forward to the next aspect of this session, which is more or less a panel discussion where we get to hear from experts and practitioners on what's happening on the ground. And I'm pretty sure there is a lot of lessons to learn. We've already had the importance on building on the crisis, the interface between NDCs and loss and damages, and the credible amount of work that the region still needs to do. But we're also confident that the region is taking the right steps in the right direction. And this is why, as Dr. Okoye just mentioned, we need to have these conversations, these dialogues needs to continue. And more importantly, we need to build not only the knowledge base, but the capacity of African climate change experts and also scientists to be able to thoroughly understand this implication, collect the data needed for scientific evidence, and most importantly, understand how to capitalize on this crisis and ensure that the Loss and Damage Fund does not become a humanitarian fund. So moving forward now to the panel discussion. So for the panel discussion, we have three experts, panelists, and they have hands-on experience on what's happening on the ground. And I think that having them in this session is going to bring a wealth of knowledge, because sometimes loss and damage is not really at the forefront of conversation unless we are heading towards COP, but we are heading towards COP. And I think this is an excellent opportunity to find out what has been happening, how has it been happening, what incredible steps have regions made, and still what are the lessons that we need to take into account. So I am just going to mention the panelists, and however they will be able to just talk about themselves briefly, starting with Papazuma Diarra. I hope you are online, Papazuma. Let me know if you're online, and then you can be able to give a brief introduction of who you are. But just briefly, Papazuma Diarra is the head of the Contingency Planning Division at the Africa Risk Capacity Agency. And then we also have Mr. Tiwonge. Mr. Tiwonge is a WFP Southern Africa Bioresilience and Climate Technical Lead. However, he is also currently the acting country director for Namibia. And with us today, we have our very own Gebru, who is the GGI Africa Regional Lead on Climate Change Instruments, MRV, and Institutional Strengthening. So starting, I believe we have some technical challenges with Mr. Jara. So we're going to start with Tiwonge. Tiwonge, just briefly about what you're doing at WFP, and then after Tiwonge, we'll go briefly to Gebru while we let Mr. Jara's technical challenges be solved, and then we're gonna dive into the panel discussion. Over to you, Tiwonge.
Thank you for the introduction, Kaone, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So as introduced, my name is Tiwonge Machwenyika, and I am based within the WFP Regional, Southern Africa Regional Bureau that looks at supporting 12 countries in the Southern Africa region where WFP operates, working around climate resilience, building resilience for the most vulnerable that WFP works with. But also currently I am in Namibia as the acting country director, supporting the country in our operations, of which Namibia is one of the countries that was heavily impacted by the El Nino driven drought of the 2023-2024 cropping season. Glad to be here and looking forward to this discussion. Back to you, Connie.
Thank you very much, Tiwonge, for that. I'm going to ask you to leave your video on because we are in for an exciting session. And then I'm going to ask Gebru, please introduce yourself briefly to some of the people who do not know you yet. So over to you, Gebru. Apologies, it seems we are having some technical challenges with Gebru, and kindly allow me to ask Mr. Jara to please kindly introduce himself and perhaps also leave his camera tuned on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Mr. Jara. We briefly introduced you as the head of the Contingency Planning Division for the Africa Risk. And now we just want just a really brief introduction to you by yourself on what you play, what role you play at ARC and how this is quite important to the discourse that we're having today. Over to you, Mr. Jara.
Thank you very much, Madam. Yes, Papa Zumana Jara, Head of Contingency Planning Division with African Risk Capacity based in Johannesburg. So practically my main role is really to support member states develop different contingency planning tool for the utilization of the payout, potential payout they might receive in the aftermath of disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jara. Now we're going to try our... Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Jara. So now we have our colleague Gebru. Now his internet is back on. Over to you, Gebru, as we've introduced you as the JTI Africa Regional Lead on Climate Change Instrument, MRV, and Institutional Strengthening. But now we want to have a little bit more information as to how this role fits a lot into the discourse we're about to have before we kickstart the panel session.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Gebru Jember. I'm a regional lead on MRV and climate diplomacy, mainly currently supporting the LDC chair, which is Malawi, advising and as well as coordinating carbon market for the group. I've been engaged in MRV and led development for Ethiopia and Burkina, and happy to be here in brief. for me forward to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for this panel discussion, we are going to start with Africa risk capacity, and this is looking at the aspects of also of data. And so one of the things we do know that ARC is actually a leader when it comes to assessing risks of countries and helping them also develop some kind of micro insurance when it comes to climate losses. So the question today I have for you, Mr. Jara, is in regards to innovative strategies, because what ARC is already doing is what we can already term it as innovative, thinking way beyond even the conversation of loss and damage picking up on this team, and especially connecting the innovative ideas that you're implementing in countries and linking that to the potential fund. How are you already working with countries, not only to collect the data when it comes to transparency, but also innovation, but now moving on to helping them to be able to mobilize the right climate finance that is needed for loss and damage. So in regards to that, what has ARC been doing on the ground, and how effective you see this linking up towards the operationalization of the fund? Over to you, Mr. Jara.
Thank you very much again. So I will say to ensure that financing, especially loss and damage, is accessible, transparent, and responsive to the need of impacted population. So I do believe that, of course, several innovative strategy and mechanism can be developed or deployed, which is we are using. So and surely this mechanism aim to improve the efficiency and equity of funding, while they can really be used to address the unique vulnerability of communities facing climate-related disaster. So to name some of the key approaches we have and that I consider really important. So number one is really, I would say, the risk pooling and sovereign insurance solution, such as building on existing model like the African risk capacity, so which pool risk across different countries in the continent. So this practically allows government to access rapid financing after a disaster without having to deplete the national reserve. So scaling, I think there's regional risk pool can ensure that more vulnerable countries can afford coverage. And for this, it will be required to develop and expand, I will say, the use of parametric insurance product that provide payouts based on pre-agreed triggers, such as, for example, rainfall threshold, wind speed. This allows, of course, a faster disbursement of funds after the occurrence of a disaster. So as the process does not depend on pre-disaster assessment. And also, countries can be encouraged to adopt what I can say I call a risk layering strategy, whereby different instruments, such as, for example, insurance for large disaster, contagious fund for smaller event, to cover different level of risk. And this ensure both accessibility and sufficiency in financing for various type of loss and damage. Moreover, number two, I will say there is need also, to develop a micro finance or micro insurance solution for communities and individuals, particularly in rural and vulnerable area. So there's should include index-based microinsurance scheme, which can be tailored to the local context. it will trigger payout based on specific, weather condition. In this case, for example, rainfall or drought threshold. So this can be done directly to affected household or communities. And of course, in the same way, it can allow to reduce bureaucracy and allow for immediate action. Last but not the least, I will say, as we do in African Risk Capacity, the operational preparedness, which consists basically of to support member states to develop contingency plan, which link up with a scalable social protection system that will allow to expand during, disaster to include more people or increase benefit. For example, during drought or flood, for example, cash transfer program or food assistance can be pre-financed and ready to deploy when climate, related disaster hit, and which will reduce the time response and ensuring also immediate relief to those vulnerable households affected. So finally, I will say for loss and damage financing to be accessible, transparent, and responsive, of course, a combination of technology, inclusive governance, data-driven models, and innovative financial instrument must be adopted, therefore empowering local communities and promoting regional and global partnership, which are crucial steps in ensuring that funds are mobilized quickly and effectively to support those most affected by climate-related disaster. Thank you, Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diarra, for that. You have mentioned a lot of important things, starting from paramedic insurance and also developing micro insurance for communities and also individuals. And I know that this is just the beginning of what you're talking about, and innovative ways in which ARC is already supporting not only communities, countries, and also individuals, especially when it comes to loss and damage, but also collecting of data, supporting them have this micro insurance that is readily available for them and can be rapidly dispersed. But I'm even more excited of the way you completed by saying that, more importantly, for the loss and damage fund to become effective in terms of operationalization, data is needed, but more importantly is partnership. And this leads right into the question that we will be asking Mr. Tiwonge, because Mr. Tiwonge is working for WFP, the Southern Africa Bureau, and this really encompasses of a lot of the SADC countries. But more importantly, Tiwonge, we want to hear from you. How can partnership and collaboration between government, civil society, and international organizations be leveraged to mitigate and prevent the harm and suffering that many people experience, especially vulnerable communities, when it comes to the impact of climate change? So how do you collectively work with your partners to support those communities, not only to mitigate, but to adapt to the impact of climate change and to the consequences of what we now call loss and damage? And how is this support supporting not only the communities and the countries develop much more robust systems, but also move them an inch closer to be able to perhaps in the future capitalize on the potential fund that is coming? Over to you, Tiwonge.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Ms. Kone. So I think what's important probably when we look at the loss and damage discussion, we are looking at those incidences when extreme events occur that are, despite the work that would have done around mitigation as well as adaptation, but that are unavoidable and irreversible in terms of the impacts that the climate crisis is presenting. Sorry. So you're looking at economic losses, you're looking at non-economic losses that people will incur, nations will incur, communities will incur by and large. Now, what does that translate to the people on the ground? It's from WFP perspective and from the work that we do within the region and across the globe, if I might add, is to look at how do we then build different partnerships across the board that either prior to the crisis happening or prior to these extreme weather events or the slow onset events occur, what can we do to either mitigate that impact or support communities to have that resilience to either adapt, absorb, or recover when the impacts occur. So our partnerships and at country level, at regional level, at continental level, and at global level, with governments, with private sector, with civil society, with international organizations, but more critically with the communities themselves, the communities that will be impacted by these events. I think those are also a key segment that needs to be part and parcel of the discussion when these kind of issues are put on the table. So now, if I think Dr. George mentioned earlier about the Paris Agreement Article 8 in terms of how it introduced loss and damages under the UNFCCC Convention. So there are areas that were identified there. And if you look at those areas, and then if you think around partnerships, all and everyone has to be part and parcel of this discussion. So if you look at the issues on early warning systems that were identified, emergency preparedness, as Mr. Diarra has outlined, if you look at the understanding, building that evidence that Dr. George was mentioning, if you look at issues of attribution, how do we use that evidence to prescribe the loss and damages to climate events? That will be key. Issues around risk assessment and management, in risk financing, looking at the insurance that was being articulated earlier, and building resilience for livelihoods and for people within this space becomes key. So if you look at that space, then organizations like WFP, like the UN, then has to create these partnerships, not only with on-the-ground activities, but across the board. So if we start talking about early warning systems, how do we work with organizations that either collect data, analyze that data, and disseminate that data to ensure that it's distilled, packaged, and delivered in a way that if at the whole hierarchy of either administrative systems in countries are able to utilize that information, understand that information, and then take appropriate action based on that information. So agencies like your meteorological services are key, agencies like ARC are key, private sector is key when you start talking about insurance, whether you're talking about microinsurance or individual farmer insurance at commercial farmers level or at smallholder farmer level. Dissemination of information is critical. How do you disseminate that information? We need those partnerships. How do we work with either radio stations, print media, the digital media, social media as well? Dissemination of that information is key. And then how do we then, at the back end of that, support the utilization of that information becomes critical. But importantly, as well as I mentioned, by the time we start talking about loss and damages, adaptation probably has failed. Our contribution towards mitigation is already fading from all intent and purposes if you read all the reports. But how can we, as Dr. George was talking about, looking at the global financing mechanism around climate adaptation, climate mitigation, can we start working at that level prior to the discussions around loss and damages? We already know the bill that's required for climate adaptation. Any estimates, if you look at maybe the Global Center for Adaptation, they put a bill of $3.3 trillion by 2035. How do we then work with the global financing mechanisms, not just the green climate funds, but your private sector global financing mechanism, your venture capitalists, your investment banks, to invest in the ability of communities to adapt to the changes that are occurring within those, where they are staying. How does that translate to the communities on the ground? What actions can we do that allows them to build that adaptive capacities across the board? And then lastly, I think we cannot ever emphasize the issue of building resilience of communities. And it's across the board. It's not just smallholder farmers that we are talking about. All the way up to either if you're working in the private sector, we all need to build resilience against what's going to happen. The changing weather patterns are going to impact everyone. The changing whether the frequency of heat waves, where the number of hot days are being projected to increase, how are we going to build resilience against that as individuals, households, communities? A lot of the Southern Africa and probably the whole of sub-Saharan Africa rely on rain-fed agriculture as the driver for smallholder farmers. With these changes and climate variabilities that are expected, what resilient building activities do we need to do across the board? So that then brings in discussions around either the academia on building these drought resilience crops, or when there's more areas where there's projection of increased precipitation, for example, what kind of adjustments needs to take place? But that requires probably academia to also start looking at that. The issue of attribution is key. How can we then attribute those changes, ascribe them to climate change, and then build the narrative that requires that particular investment, from adaptation all the way to when the losses are do okay for the particular communities that we work with. So from WFP perspective, and that engagement across the spectrum of all partners, including the communities themselves, is critical. I'll stop here. Back to you, Connie.
Thank you very much, Tiwonge. It's actually it's such a beautiful fusion between what Mr. Jared just mentioned on risk insurance, risk mitigation, and collection of evidence. And then what you mentioned, that you actually need all this to build stronger partnership, because each one of these tools and these processes, they do play a key role, especially in the knowledge that is needed to either decide what is the most effective strategy to move forward. So, and one of the things you've actually mentioned is that building partnership is not just between intergovernmental organization, international organization, but it transcends and also giving communities a much more larger role to play and feel to be part and parcel to the solutions as well. And I think that this is incredible. A lot of the time, the discourse is so high level that it actually forgets that the beneficiaries, they need to be involved also in the solution. And more importantly, what you have mentioned is that risk parameters do come also with the involvement of the private sector, bringing in the banks to play a key role in all of that. And that's all incredible. So we actually do have 1 hour 30 minutes for this session. So as we're heading towards the question on going back to the genesis, and this is going back to the UNFCCC processes, I would like to ask Gebru, based on your experience in working directly with the UNFCCC processes, how effective do you think that it is important to have this discussion? How was it brought to the table, and how has organization such as GGGI been playing a key role, actually helping other communities as much as also Agnes is doing, to bring the discourse much more further and have a much more pungent role in regards to what can be done, what should be done. And also beyond that, Gebru, in your role as working on climate action, how do you move that from the high level, from the UNFCCC perspective, and bring it down to the country's perspective, especially in countries whereby GGGI has offices? So over to you, Gebru, on your perception, and also how do you bring that from the high level down to the community level? Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Tiwonge, for that. That was excellent. Over to you, Gebru.
Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Gabriel. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes,
Oh,
thanks.
Perfect. Very sorry. Again, good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. First, respond to your first guiding question regarding how it has been already started. I mean, personally, I believe that there has to be synergy among all environmental conventions and protocols, including desertification, biodiversity, the Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, across all dimensions. There has to be a synergy. But when you look at the what's loss and damage, it's we all know that's the negative effect of climate change that occurs irrespective of whatever we do on mitigation and adaptation, as we are very late. So from that point of view, the right place to start at the global level on the discussion in addressing loss and damage will be UNFCCC. So from that point of view, still, we see that when negotiations started back in 1997, there was a kind of we can call it climate change literacy among parties. There was no convergence on the issue of climate change, whether it's man-made or natural phenomenon. That has contributed a lot for not addressing the issue as an urgent manner. So even when you look at adaptation, initially the convention started by discussing and addressing mitigation issues. But in the meantime, parties asked, while we mitigate, we have to address, we have to build resilience as the damage is already on the ground. So from that point of view, adaptation has been discussed, and immediate needs and for the most vulnerable has been agreed through the NAPA process. Imagine with the NAPA process, we do immediate adaptation needs for the most vulnerable ones. While we negotiate, still loss and damage is happening. So overall, since we are late on mitigation, we get into adaptation era. And since we are not doing enough on adaptation, now we are on loss and damage. As we are late on acting on the ground, the cost for addressing both mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage is going to be very high. So this is the situation where we are. So UNFCCC is the right place because now all the world leaders at the global level have been meeting regularly. So I see more synergies happening on sustainable development. It's more of really greening the development is happening at the global level. How we can make it down to the countries and the communities level, it's a process which is a bit not really moving fast, but that's what's happening now. And currently now we are at a rise of 1.1 degrees Celsius above the mean. And 1.5 is not really the best goal, which we should have set. We should have gone to negative emission by this point in time if we are to reduce the impact of loss and damage. So from that point of view, even some places in the world are no more able to really address the impact of climate change by doing adaptation alone. We have to do more action in addressing loss and damage, both short-term as well as long-term, including really permanent migration of people in small islands. So with this context, when you look at the process, how it started, so from 1997 onwards, adaptation was moving slowly. Then loss and damage, back in Paris in 2015, we managed to come up with Article 8, but the challenge was we are not thinking that we are in one world. We create our boundaries, being developed and developing. So from that point of view, it's not really to address the issue. It's how can I protect my country or my group's interests? That has been dominating the whole process. So from that point of view, like while developing countries have been struggling to have this article, developed countries were also trying their best not to have any liability or compensation in the agreement. So finally, they managed to come up with this text in the COP decision in Paris. So, and then after that, after 6 years in Glasgow, we came up with a Glasgow dialogue to discuss possible arrangements for loss and damage funding, since Paris couldn't clearly identify the funding part of it. So after 6 years, we start a 2-year process of discussing the issue. And then in Sharm el-Sheikh, we managed to set up a formal agenda and on a loss and damage fund to be operationalized after a year. That was in Durban, in Dubai. So as we all know, in Dubai, so we set the loss and damage fund in motion, and World Bank has been said to be the host. The same for Santiago Network on loss and damage, which is more of providing technical support. It's going to be under UNDDR and UN Office for Project Services as a host. So the financial arrangement has been now very clear. But what I want to bring here is what kind of finance are we looking for? We have to look the quality and quantity of finance. Sometimes, when countries which are in a position to contribute, they give us some amount of money, we should be able to check that, is it diversion of resource? Is it diversion of the fund that has to be given for addressing mitigation and adaptation? That, I think we have to check. And we do believe that there has to be synergy among the resources as well. Because if you address loss and damage and then stop, then the communities will not be having a sustainable environment. So after addressing any shock, you have to start acting on building resilience. While you build the resilience, you have to also do mitigation activities. So from this point, there is no clear boundary between addressing any shock and building resilience and reducing greenhouse gas in that given country. So from that point of view, there has to be synergy on the utilization of resources, synergy in our planning and implementation. So from that point of view, we have to check the quality and quantity of finance. Is it the business as usual finance which is coming from a few developed countries, or do we need to think of an innovative financial source? Otherwise, if it's diversion from the other source to loss and damage, it will not help sustaining development. So from that point of view, what innovative financial sources we should have to consider, I think that will be a big task for all of us ahead of, from COP29 onwards. And what we are doing at GGI, actually, we don't want to duplicate efforts. When we look at what's happening globally, we see that there is a gap on knowledge on loss and damage. So how can we really connect dots in generating knowledge at the global level? So we done some kind of assessment, situation analysis, where countries are in terms of addressing loss and damage. And we developed some materials which could be utilized across communities in the world for countries to better know and better plan. And besides that, we feel that loss and damage cannot be addressed as a standalone. So how we can support countries in integrating loss and damage into their short, medium, and long-term plans. Like, for instance, if I give you an example of Ethiopia, we managed to integrate adaptation into our NDC, our 10 years development plan, as well as our net zero 2050 vision. The same with Burkina Faso as well. Now we are working and developing a guideline for integrating loss and damage into the NDC cycles, as well as LEDs. Otherwise, if we think in a project by project as a standalone, it is not going to be sustainable. A simple example, in Southern African countries, there is severe drought. And there will be a severe economical, social, and quite interlinked sector-wide impact. If we are going to build resilience to these communities, first we need to absorb the shock. That means we need loss and damage fund. But we should not end there. We have to build from there. That means before you build resilience, you have to adjust the baseline from where it was a year ago or 2 years ago. So from that point of view, integration is a sustainable approach rather than addressing it alone. So this is what we are doing globally and at national level as well. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gebru. I think you also responded to the third question, which is incredible. So thank you so much for the depth of knowledge that you brought in and actually fusing in what Tiwonge and Mr. Jara have also mentioned, that when you are looking at loss and damage, there has to be a vertical, horizontal way of approaching it, coming from the top-up approach which you've mentioned at the UNFCCC, whereby most of the negotiation, the policies are actually made, and then transcending that to the countries, and that's taken on board by organizations not only such as GGGI, but WFP and ARC, trying to make sure that whatever we bring to the forefront, to the ground, to the communities, to the people, and to the individuals are actually knowledge-based practices that can support the countries, but also fusing in the policies and the discussions that have been taken over at the high level. But as we now conclude, I know there were other questions, but the discussions have been so exciting that we unfortunately have to close in about 15 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly ask Mr. Jara, just quickly, based on the ARC point of view, how can you give us 3 ways in which ARC has been supporting member countries, its member countries, to be able to effectively take advantage of the new fund should it become operational? So how are you already preempting? So this is a question not only for you, Mr. Jara, but also for you, Tiwonge and Gebru. Just 3 points briefly. What have you been doing to help countries already leapfrog towards operationalization of the fund? Over to you, Mr. Jara.
Yeah, well, as you can see over the years, of course, ARC is, making available this risk financing tool to all the African member states in order for them to really get this funding quickly and to address the need of the vulnerable population that has been impacted by natural disaster. So, and this really somehow, if we look at through this work, ARC using different sources of data and advanced analytic, so which make it ARC able to provide country with those tools which they need really to prepare for, respond, and recover from natural disaster. So, and the data-driven approach really ensure that interventions are timely, targeted, and effective in protecting vulnerable population and their livelihood. And of course, yes, different, which I mentioned also, which is very critical with their simulation, ARC somehow, helping the policymaker to understand particularly the range of potential losses, and then the government are provided with technical assistance also to design contingency plan based on stimulated disaster scenario, so which outline how government and humanitarian organization can respond to specific event, ensuring again, that a rapid action is taken, which is very critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Jara. Now over to you, Tiwonge, on those three important critical tools or processes that WFP is implementing.
Okay, thank you for that. I think probably to contextualize a lot of these things is to also appreciate the gendered nature of these issues. So it's, and not just across the issue of gender, but across how different communities, different countries, and different areas are being impacted now as things unravel and as the pace of those intensity and the frequency of these issues gather pace and going to impact communities more and more as we go forward. So one of the things that we look at is how do we look at these kind of issues from a gender perspective? What are these particular issues and how are they impacting women, men, boys, and girls differently? What issues are we going to see going forward? I think one of the issues that Mr. Gabriel mentioned was around migration. How is that going to happen? If it happens, who is most impacted? And then how, as WFP or as we implement our programs, how do we fit into those issues? So a lot of the issues that we have to look at is from those various perspectives. So there are communities that are going to be impacted, but they are not going to move. How do we work and build the resilience capacities of those communities? And how is the financing going to be set up to address those particular issues? So the adoption side of things, I think, as was articulated earlier, issues of Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, GEF, those are resources that are available for building the part of the resilience capacities of communities, as well as other investment or funds that come through. But then the issue is, how do we make it that, or how do we put on the table the discussions that those funds should not be contributing to the loss and damages, to the loss and damages fund. So I think that's the dilution and the diffusion issue that was being articulated earlier. So a lot of our advocacy issues around this is around that. We still need to do a lot around adaptation, around resilience building for communities, around skills development for communities and countries and regions, and all the whole administrative infrastructure that countries have. So that's one part. The other part, I think, it's community engagement and community engagement across the board. How do we, as WFP, we engage with communities? We have our operations in these communities, and we have touch points with these communities. As we are doing our programs, how do we bring the issue around climate crisis and then the impacts of those and build the attribution issue that was being discussed earlier? We usually are consumers of evidence, of data, of all of the scientific evidence that is put across. But on the reverse side, we have touch points and engagement with the communities on the ground. How can we bring their experiences and their understanding of the issues on the ground back up so that they are part and parcel of the discussions? And then lastly, I think a lot of advocacy is what we can do. We shouldn't get tired of articulating these issues on different platforms. Whatever platforms we get, we continue to advocate for the needs that are across the continent. And there are huge needs that are on the continent. How do we parcel those needs, attribute them to different issues, and then package them so that they are amplified across the globe and at platforms like the COP, the different COPs. I think there will be there's a COP on the UNCCD on desertification. There's a COP there in Saudi Arabia. There is the discussions on the 3 basins. If you look at the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin and the one in Southeast in Asia. All of those platforms, I think, are critical platforms for us to articulate issues. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiwonge, for that. I believe we will only be able to take perhaps one question. So Gebru, I'm going to hand over to you for the three things, maybe very, very briefly, that GGGI highlights when it comes to working with countries, or even at the high level when it comes to loss and damage. Then after that, we might be able to open the floor for one question. Over to you, Gebru, briefly on three important things we should be taking away from this session.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the first takeaway would be like, I'm not pessimistic, but still we have to control expectations. You know, we know how GCF, how many years it took to be operationalized. With this loss and damage fund, we're just starting. So GCF was 6+ years. So at least with this process, we have to really advocate and the easy functioning of the fund, and innovative financial sources have to be really discussed and agreed rather than diverting resources. And in what GIA is doing, I mean, like, we have been really, we will keep on generating the required knowledge on integration and other aspects of it. But in the meantime, we have to really do proper planning. Because if the fund is operational, again, there will be the usual process for accessing the fund. So we have to really keep on capacitating our member countries to get accredited, to build the capacity so that they can access the fund whenever it's ready. And at the same time, we need to support our member countries to integrate loss and damage in their planning cycles. And at the same time, while the resources governments have make their own it's natural to prioritize countries and divert development-related funds to address loss and damage when it happens. It slows down development for countries, but still they have to do it for their communities. But we need to document how much resources we are diverting and utilizing for addressing loss and damage, because we have to report it to the global community that we have been really doing this. So from that point of view, we will support our member countries to develop a green coding for the budgetary system, as well as in our efforts on the ground. While we facilitate implementation, we have to see how we can have an integrated approach in our intervention sites. For instance, if there is any loss and damage happening, how we can really allocate resources first to address the happened loss and damage, and as well as supporting on evidence generation and reporting. So these are the kind of support which we have been doing and we are going to do across the value chain. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gebru. I am a little bit worried that we may not have time for questions, so maybe we might be able to take one question. So I'm going to look into the question and see if there is any question that anyone wants to ask. If so, please feel free to unmute yourself. However, also please note that we are happy to take all the questions that we have, and we have the contact details of all the incredible panelists that were here today, and they can be able to dedicate a much detailed response to you if you have a question in regards to perhaps something that wasn't so clear. So if you would permit me, we will probably skip the Q&A session today, and we are going to hand over to Dr. Male. But before that, I want to thank all the panelists for the incredible breadth of knowledge that you've brought in today in regards to loss and damage, with a deep emphasis on Africa. And I hope that today a lot of us have learned something. And of course, one thing that is important, partnership is important, and collaboration across countries, region, institution, and also at the higher and the lower levels is important. And most importantly, practicing at the bottom level, whereby a lot of the work from ARC and ACNES is being done, working with communities, working with countries, is important. So before I close on the behalf of Dr. Male, I would like to invite Dr. Male back to give us a closing. I believe we have about 2 minutes to go. So over to you, Dr. Male. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Dr. Male.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also thank you very much, Naima, for the excellent moderation and really for walking us through the session with dynamics, also energy as well. Was quite engaging so far. And I also would like to take the moment to say thank you very much to all the panelists from ACNES, ARC, WFP, but also our colleagues, Gebru, for really sharing insightful perspective. But as we heard today, the Loss and Damage Fund, while the landmark achievement from the COP27, represent only the beginning of a long journey. The discussion have reaffirmed the urgent need for us to move beyond announcement into concrete actions, ensuring that this fund is structured and delivered in a way that delivers the most who need it. We have seen how impact of the climate change are being felt across the continent. And I can tell you that the community are facing increasingly frequent drought, food insecurity, and ecosystem loss. The example shared today is from our key expert and panelists from insurance mechanism or emergency responses to a long-term resilient building, highlight the different approach being taken across Africa. That's also underscored the critical importance of collaboration in achieving the result we need. As we look ahead, it's clear that adaptation and mitigation effort must go hand in hand with strong financial support to protect the most vulnerable community. We must ensure that the Loss and Damage Fund is not only about short-term relief, but also about building long-term resilience in a way that empower local populations and help them rebuild in a sustainable way. This session has made it clear the solutions are within our reach. And with the strategic coordination and we continue dialoguing and having conversation, we can turn this fund into a transformative force for good. Let's ensure that the community suffering most from the climate crisis are not just heard, but supported with the resources and the opportunity they deserve. Thank you again, all the panelists. Thanks also for the participants, those joining online, also in person, and look forward to seeing you how collectively we take this discussion forward into a meaningful action. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chiwonge. Thank you, Mr. Jara, and thank you, Gebru. Excellent work.